Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. Does prayer work? If you know enough religious people, you no doubt have encountered someone in the past who testified as to the effectiveness of prayer. Even if you don't know someone directly, we've all heard the cliched stories of the person who was terminally ill, a case where medical science and all of the doctors in the world asserted that there was no hope of recovery. And yet, miraculously, after some faithful prayer, the individual inexplicably improves and ultimately gets better. Needless to say, religious adherents proudly claim that such instances are examples of prayer in action. They believe that said cases would have resulted in death were it not for the devoted prayers of the faithful. I find myself continuously surprised by how persuasive these stories are and how many people take them seriously. And to be clear, I'm not doubting that such instances occur. It's obviously true that there are numerous cases where individuals make remarkable recoveries despite the odds. My question is, what evidence is there that prayer is responsible? It frequently comes up in this podcast, but I must say it again because it's so relevant here. But correlation does not equate to causation. The fact that you prayed for something and then that thing happened is not evidence that prayer is effective. What you have there is a correlation, one thing following another. So let's imagine I'm a farmer who prays for rain because my crops will otherwise perish, and let's suppose that it rains after my prayer. In a one-off case like that, it's trivially easy to dismiss it as coincidence. So let's bolster the hypothetical and imagine that every time the farmer prays for rain, rain soon follows. Would that prove that prayer is effective? If you think yes, again, you're mistaken. You see, even if you could repeat the phenomenon, which is not the case when it comes to prayer, but even if you could repeat the phenomenon, you still wouldn't have proven that prayer is effective or that there's a God involved. At that point, you'd have an observable pattern, and then and only then would the true investigation begin. That's when the causal connection would be explored and determined, if indeed the causal factor or factors could be determined. You can't just assert that such a pattern is best explained by the divine. That would have to be demonstrated. And please bear in mind that we're talking about the best case scenario here, a situation where an individual's prayers reliably correlate with observable real-world events. Needless to say, there are no such examples like this in the real world. Instead, what we have is a hodgepodge of random and individual cases where someone or a group of people prayed for something that came to pass. Their previous and subsequent prayers have all yielded no results, but no religious thinker wants to focus on those. Instead, they cherry-pick the one example where a terminally ill child undergoes a remarkable and rare recovery, and they allege that the desperate parents' plea to God has something to do with it. It seems all too obvious to me that the rarity of such occurrences is not evidence of God's extremely infrequent intervention, but rather it has much more to do with the nature of illness, genetics, and biological probabilities. I mean, sure, certain forms of cancer have very low probabilities of survival associated with them, but remission is not impossible. It's just improbable. And given that most people on the planet are religious, it's inevitable that some prayer at some point in time is going to align with a situation where just such an improbable recovery occurs. In other words, a basic understanding of probability theory easily accounts for any coincidence wherein a prayer aligns with a remarkable recovery. Furthermore, please notice the absurdity. Why do such miraculous recoveries always and inevitably surround illnesses where there's a precedent for natural, albeit rare, survival? As Christopher Hitchens put it, of all the prayers answered, there's not one restored amputee among them. Surely if God can answer a prayer to cure someone's cancer, it would be a triviality for him to restore a limb or two. But the cries and whimpers of amputees fall on deaf ears. Does God have something against the disabled? Or is it perhaps the case that there simply isn't a God? Obviously, such restorations are not possible, biologically speaking. But if they were, please notice that the religious would not hesitate to assert that each and every one was evidence of the effectiveness of prayer. Needless to say, and if it wasn't abundantly clear already, this kind of thinking is fundamentally irrational. And yet, it's all too easy to fall victim to it. I catch myself even now, despite my atheistic outlook, attributing agency where there evidently is none. Sometimes things just work out in my favor, and I'm reminded of the religious thinking I engaged in earlier in my life. I think if I were still religious, this moment would have served as further ratification of my faith. One recent example that comes to mind is lockdown. You see, lockdown was, all things considered, beneficial for me. It gave me time I would never normally have to develop my channel and to grow my platform. Were I still religious, and preposterous though it might be, I might have been tempted to conclude that God had orchestrated this in order to confer a benefit on my life. And you'd be quick to point out that such thinking would be ludicrous because of the devastation that the pandemic caused, be it the death toll, the psychological impact, the economic consequences, or what have you. You'd rightly accuse me of being self-centered and irrational. But ask yourself, are other prayers and the allegedly resulting benefits any different? Take the example of the parent that alleges that their child was spared because of their prayers. Were their prayers just better than the prayers of the other religious parents whose children died in vain? In my view, there's a terrible vanity to the notion that God not only stepped in, but he stepped in especially for you. You're special. There's an arrogance and irrationality, conscious or not, that's utterly bewildering to me. The best real-world example I can think of is that of Julian Kopka. Julian Kopka was on board a flight with 91 other passengers when it was struck by lightning. Consequently, the plane took a nosedive and crashed in the Amazonian rainforest. Remarkably, Julian Kopka survived while the other 91 passengers tragically died, including Julian's own mother. If you Google this story, and I encourage you to do so, you won't have to scroll very far before you encounter numerous religious websites that claim Julian Kopka's story as a miraculous intervention by God.
Well, if the Lord can save Julianne, God can save you.
This is preposterous. The other 91 passengers perished, and yet Julian Kopka's survival is attributed to the divine. So God evidently plays favorites, it would seem. Julian Kopka was worthy of saving while the other 91 people were deleted. And the problem goes even deeper than the death toll. Remember, this plane was struck by lightning, a naturally occurring phenomenon rooted in the laws of physics. And if indeed there is a creator God, this God designed the physical laws knowing that lightning would inevitably take the lives of innocent human beings. So ultimately, religious adherents who attribute Julian Kopka's survival to God are essentially thanking God for sparing one life out of 92 from a catastrophe that God is responsible for to begin with, and could have prevented anyway. This kind of faith is just too much for me to swallow. But I digress. Whether or not you believe in the power of prayer, you may accuse me of being too narrow-minded. Or perhaps you'll accuse me of bias and irrationality because I can't prove that prayer doesn't work. Leaving aside that such a claim would in fact count as a reversal of the burden of proof, there is actual empirical data on the question of the effectiveness of prayer. The study I'm referring to is detailed in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. I could explain the study myself, but Dawkins has already done that for me. And I quote, "An amusing, if rather pathetic, case study in miracles is the great prayer experiment. Does praying for patients help them recover? Prayers are commonly offered for sick people, both privately and in formal places of worship. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, was the first to analyze scientifically whether praying for people is efficacious. He noted that every Sunday, in churches throughout Britain, entire congregations prayed publicly for the health of the royal family. Shouldn't they, therefore, be unusually fit compared to the rest of us, who are prayed for only by our nearest and dearest? Galton looked into it and found no statistical difference. His intention may, in any case, have been satirical, as also when he prayed over randomized plots of land to see if the plants would grow any faster. They didn't. So this just sets the stage for the details of the study which are forthcoming. But it is interesting, if only anecdotal, to point out the obviously higher number of prayers that are said for public figures like the royal family. If indeed prayer is effective, wouldn't we expect to find a higher quality of health and fitness, etc.? But let's continue, and I quote, "Such experiments, if done properly, have to be double-blind, and this standard was strictly observed. The patients were assigned, strictly at random, to an experimental group, received prayers, or a control group, received no prayers. Neither the patients nor their doctors or caregivers nor the experimenters were allowed to know which patients were being prayed for and which patients were controls. Those who did the experimental praying had to know the names of the individuals for whom they were praying, otherwise in what sense would they be praying for them rather than for somebody else? The team monitored 1,802 patients at 6 hospitals, all of whom received coronary bypass surgery. The patients were divided into 3 groups. Group 1 received prayers and didn't know it. Group 2, the control group, received no prayers and didn't know it. Group 3 received prayers and did know it. The comparison between groups 1 and 2 tests for the efficacy of intercessory prayer. Group 3 tests for possible psychosomatic effects of knowing that one is being prayed for. Prayers were delivered by the congregations of 3 churches, one in Minnesota, one in Massachusetts, and one in Missouri, all distant from the 3 hospitals. The praying individuals, as explained, were given only the first name and initial letter of the surname of each patient for whom they were to pray. It is good experimental practice to standardize as far as possible, and they were all, accordingly, told to include in their prayers the phrase, "for a successful surgery with a quick, healthy recovery and no complications." The results, reported in the American Heart Journal of April 2006, were clear-cut. There was no difference between those patients who were prayed for and those who were not. What a surprise. There was a difference between those who knew they had been prayed for and those who did not know one way or the other, but it went the wrong direction. Those who knew they had been the beneficiaries of prayer suffered significantly more complications than those who did not. Was God doing a bit of smiting to show his disapproval of the whole barmy enterprise? Theists reacted to this study by claiming that God would never answer such prayers because they're not genuine. But this begs the question, what is a genuine prayer? It seems to me that from a theist perspective, genuine is just a label for prayers that incidentally come true, whereas prayers that yield no result just weren't genuine enough. Or perhaps God just said no. Please notice that this kind of thinking is unfalsifiable. Nothing could possibly count against it. The claim is constructed in such a manner as to prevent investigation or critique. It's no different to the fortune teller's gambit, where the prediction that the fortune teller makes either happens or it hasn't happened yet. Colloquially, this is known as emphasizing the hits and burying the misses. Again, this way of thinking disallows the possibility of being incorrect. Perhaps, and here's a radical idea, the fortune teller is full of shit. And perhaps the options are best described as the fortune teller is either A, lucky, in the sense that their vague guess comes to pass after the application of some interpretive acrobatics, or B, the fortune teller was just unequivocally incorrect. You see, the strength of a proposition is found in one's ability to test it. Constructing a claim that's impervious to investigation does not make that claim a strong one. In fact, such claims should cause your skeptical alarm bells to start ringing. And this is precisely what's so dubious about the concept of prayer. If one prays and nothing happens, the theist of course fails to recognize the possibility that God's non-existence could in fact explain why nothing happened after said prayer. Instead, the only options that are entertained are gems like, God heard your prayer and the answer was no. In other words, God rejected your request. The other explanation involves the aforementioned allegation that one's prayer simply wasn't genuine enough. Try telling that to the parent who prays with all of their might for the recovery of their terminally ill child, only to be repaid with cold, harsh indifference and the ultimate demise of everything they hold dear. I wouldn't dare speak to someone that way. Such a thought would never even occur. My final prayer, were I to utter one, would go something like this. Dear God, I pray for a day when people no longer trivialize important subjects with reference to evidentially bankrupt ideas. I'll let you know if it comes true, But remember, even if it does, we'd still be no closer to verifying if indeed a God was responsible.